is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime! Welcome to the show, folks. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice going. We've got a great show tonight. I am pumped for it. It is a direction that we have never taken before on Night Fright, and that is, was there a conspiracy in making up a composite character we know today as William Shakespeare? That's right, folks. We're going to be looking at a Shakespeare conspiracy. The book is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. Our guest tonight is Katherine Chiljan, all the way from San Francisco, might I add, where I had the greatest of times. San Francisco is world-class, folks. If you've never been there, go there. I spent the whole day at Alcatraz and absolutely loved it. Katherine, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. And as I said before, I'm pumped because this is something very, very special.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity of talking about this conspiracy.
How's life in San Francisco tonight?
Oh, it's absolutely beautiful. It was very warm. It was in the 70s, clear, very nice day.
Do you have a basement, by the way?
A basement?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, that's okay. Do you have spare rooms? Because we've got 35 million Canadians that are suffering in 40-degree weather right now, getting on a bus ready to come down and visit you.
Yes. Sorry about that. Canada.
All right, let's start off. Now, what in the world got you to think that there may be a conspiracy behind what we know as the Bard, William Shakespeare?
Yes, I always liked Shakespeare, and I remember when I first looked at Hamlet, and inside of the edition there was a list of the plays, and I thought it odd that after they put the dates of the plays, and after each date was a question mark, and I thought that was odd. And I thought after 400 years, I still don't know when Hamlet was written, or Merchant of Venice. And it was shortly thereafter that I saw a debate on television between Charlton Ogburn, who is a proponent of the Earl of Oxford as Shakespeare, and he was debating a Princeton professor who was giving just the orthodox line about Shakespeare. And one man was making sense point after point after point, and that was Ogburn. And the professor really was kind of, I would say, almost dumbfounded. I mean, he just was not able to produce any evidence at all to prove his case. And I thought, that's really weird. And I'm going to read Charlton Ogburn's book, and it's called The Mysterious William Shakespeare, and that was back in '84. And just reading it, it just electrified me. I just couldn't believe that there was no evidence to support the notion that the great author Shakespeare was the same person who we all believe was hailed from Stratford upon Avon, a small town, north of London. And I just wanted to start telling people about it. I just thought that it's a totally underreported story that people need full information about. So many people love and admire Shakespeare. They love the plays. They love the works. But nothing's known about the man.
Very little's known about William Shakespeare. That's without question. But the works, we're going to examine this tonight, folks, to see if Mr. Shakespeare actually existed or if he was indeed a composite character. Katherine, was this a story of a class struggle? Is this why I hearken back to the Titanic, of course, and, we all know that the people in third class, steerage, they were called. And this is the 1900s. This certainly wasn't 4 years ago, so I imagine the classes were much more distinct even back then than they are today, or in the 1900s. Was this a class struggle where perhaps something like we saw in the McCarthy era, Hollywood writers being blacklisted because they were writing things that weren't apropos, perhaps considered communist, maybe rubbing people the wrong way, going against the grain, and these unknown writers had to come up with a character in order to have their works published?
Well, I would say a form of class struggle was involved. I believe that the name William Shakespeare was the great author's pen name, his alias, and he was a very highly ranked nobleman, and it was considered a déclassé thing to be involved or associated with the theater. And actors and the people who hung around the theater were considered. It was considered kind of low life, and he couldn't kind of soil his noble name by people generally knowing that he was deeply involved in the theater and poetry and literature in general. So I think that I think there is something having to do with class with the problem.
Was Shakespeare just one person? I was always under the impression, when it came to a conspiracy about Shakespeare, that there may have been more than one writer involved.
Yes, and they still believe that there are several writers involved. I don't buy into that theory. I believe that the great author wrote all of the plays. Maybe one or two have been added to after his death, like, for example, The Two Noble Kinsmen. It was probably, in my opinion, a very, very old play, very early play, that was added to by John Fletcher after the great author had died. But I think that the reason why that they kind of have a sense that he may have co-authored, with other writers of the period, was because Shakespeare wrote so many plays, and they're greatly restrained by the biography of the man born in Stratford-on-Avon. They believe that he wrote approximately circa 1590 to circa 1613, and that's not a very big length of time to have written almost 40 plus plays. They keep adding new plays to the canon, so they kind of think that he probably co-wrote. But if you remove those limitations of a biography of the Stratford man, open it up, then you can see evidence that the plays were written decades earlier than circa 1590. They were written, I have found evidence, circa in the 1560s. That was 1564 was when the Stratford man was born. So, that then you have maybe a 40-year span or a 30 to 40-year span of writing all these plays. And that's why, they have various quality. I think that's another reason why they think that they were co-authored, because actually some of the early plays, he wasn't as good as he became a little bit later. So they think, oh, well, that must be evidence that someone else was writing that play, And so you can begin to see how... It
could have been just writer's block, too, folks.
Yeah, well, you can see how if you have the wrong man and the wrong biography, then you're going to come to wrong conclusions. And in my opinion, that's a good deal, of course, of what's happened with, I would say, 75% of Shakespeare scholarship.
Okay, I want to get into some of the evidence you've looked at to lead you to believe that William Shakespeare was a nobleman. But on the conspiratorial avenue, just another question on that. A great deal of Shakespeare's plays are very political in nature. There's an underlining, I guess, not only good against evil, but the common people against the establishment, if you will. It seems to be a vein that's very common, and he gets into occultism too. Comedy of Errors comes to mind in a comedic way, but certainly that must have pissed the church off as well. Could this have been another reason why he adopted a pseudonym?
Yes, I would say so. If you look at, for example, Hamlet.
Good
Hamlet,
example.
it's been acknowledged by historians for a very long time, at least a century, that one of the main characters of Hamlet, his name is Polonius, was actually a lampooning of the Queen's top minister, who is Lord Burleigh. There's name clues that certainly identify him, as well as the precepts where Polonius is giving advice to his son. That's a very well-known speech, like neither a borrower nor a lender be, and several other precepts. It was a complete parallel with Lord Burleigh, who had written precepts on his own for his children, and they weren't even published when the Stratford man was alive. But going back to the political, yes, I mean, how can you lampoon the most powerful man in the country and get away with it? So yes, I think that there are definitely political aspects to some of the plays. Even Richard III, many people during this era associated the hunchback king, Richard III, with another top minister who was Sir Robert Cecil. Again, how could the great author, whoever he was, live with this type of political associations? And nothing ever happened to Shakespeare as far as we know.
www.nightfrightshow.com, folks. There you will find tonight's guest book cover. Click on that, and that'll take you right to a place where you can order the book, Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. Our guest tonight, Katherine Chiljan. Have I pronounced it correctly at least once tonight? Oh, thank goodness, folks. You know, it's not easy being a Canadian with a Canadian accent and saying about all the time, and, you know, what can I tell you? Okay, let's get into some of the evidence that's ever present that people just don't realize. Now, do we have records of Shakespeare's actual birth?
Well, when we're talking about Shakespeare, we're talking about the Stratford man, right? The
That's
person
correct.
We all attribute the works to right now. There's not a birth record, but a christening record. They usually happen 2 or 3 days after. So that christening record, I believe, was April 26th. So they have conjectured that he was born on the 23rd of April. So yes, we do have that. But what about the things that we don't have, like evidence of schooling? There is no evidence that he went to school. We don't have any manuscripts or letters in his handwriting. There is no evidence that he was patronized. No payments to an actor named William Shakespeare or a writer named William Shakespeare. There's a lot of zeros attached to the great author and the Stratford man. And they need to be explained. Actually, a fascinating thing is when the Stratford man died in 1616, there was no word at all that the great Shakespeare, the writer of Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet and Macbeth, had died. Absolutely no notice taken at all. And yet, other writers of the period, like Francis Beaumont, he was a playwright, when he died, which was the same year as the Stratford man, many people took note of it. And he was buried in Westminster Abbey, which is a great honor. And yet here you have supposedly the wildly popular Shakespeare during his lifetime, who 2 monarchs enjoyed his works, and yet there was no tributes at his death. So that's a very strange thing. So the more you delve into the Stratford man and these absences, the stranger it gets. And all of this can be explained if the name was actually someone's pen name. And that's what my whole book's about.
Katherine, is there, we're doing an interview right now, and this will be up on YouTube, by the way, folks, as all our guest shows are, and they'll be up there forever. So the record will live on as long as there's a YouTube, as long as there's something called the internet. 10, 20 years, 50 years, whatever, there will be a record of this. Was there no interviews conducted that have survived with William Shakespeare or something surrounding that? And also, it's very often when a playwright, well, always when a playwright has a play, he always shows up for the opening, or she always shows up for the opening night. Is there no evidence that he was ever brought out on stage in much the same way that a Mozart would be present at an opening night of his own works, something along
Yes,
those
there's
lines?
absolutely zero evidence.
Zero.
And the great author plays were, as I mentioned, shown before royalty, the Queen Elizabeth I and King James. We have it on record with Elizabeth that she saw Love's Labour's Lost and Merry Wives of Windsor, and that, if you believe what was printed on title pages, and also Twelfth Night. There's a record that more than likely it was Twelfth Night, the play that was performed with an ambassador present. But there's no mention of Shakespeare being present. There's no mention of her talking to Shakespeare. And yet she knew other playwrights, like, for example, John Lilly. John Lilly wrote plays for her. And we have records of John Lilly writing letters to her. There's some interaction, but nothing for Shakespeare. And when she died, then there was a new king, King James. And in 1604, 1605, there were at least 6 Shakespeare plays performed for the winter season. And yet, as far as we know, the great author was not there. Shakespeare was not there. Stratford man was alive and well. Where was he? So, yes.
Is there any
everywhere you look, you don't find him.
Is there any evidence of Stratford man showing up at any of these plays, or perhaps being in the entourage or something along those lines?
Well, the interesting thing about the Stratford man is, as far as we can tell, he was a member of 2 acting companies, the Lord Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men. But as far as actual fact that he acted, we don't have that. We just know he was a member of an acting company. But acting is not writing. They're 2 different things.
Completely.
So, because of these absences where we do have payments to other writers, we do know when the roles that other actors played, like Richard Burbage and Edward Allen. Those were huge superstar actors during that time frame, and we know the roles that they played. But everything about Shakespeare is a zero. No one claimed to have met him during his lifetime.
Well, you bring up a very interesting perspective and also a very interesting point. Whenever a playwright's play is utilized, folks, by a theater troupe, there are royalties that have to be paid out to the writer. That's how they earn their living, of course. Is there any paper trail of royalties being paid out to anybody when Shakespeare's plays were put on?
Well, there was a payment given to 3 servants of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, of the Lord Chamberlain, and actually William Shakespeare was named as one of the receivers of the payment, along with 2 actors. But outside of that one payment, and we don't know, what the payment was just for performing before the Queen. But outside of that, that's all we have, and we don't know if it was for writing. It was on behalf of that group that these 3 people were accepting payment from the Queen's Chamberlain. So, it's inconclusive. And you have to keep in mind that this payment, which was in 1595, the Stratford man was 30 years old at that point. Now we're talking about the very first reference to Shakespeare, the Stratford man, and the theater. He was 30 years old. Now, in his 20s, the Shakespeare scholars will tell you those are the lost years, 1585 to 1592. Well, nothing is known about him. And here he was in his 20s. What was he doing? It's just a huge gap that's unexplainable. And that's where they make up things about him. They say, maybe he went to Europe with a nobleman, or maybe he was a schoolmaster, or maybe he was, a law clerk. And they make up all these things. That's all they can do.
Speculate.
The records are so sparse for the Stratford man.
That's unbelievable. Yeah, and I was going to ask you, do any of the original manuscripts still exist to this day?
No, not one.
Not one.
Not one line exists in a manuscript. And Ben Jonson, he was a playwright of the period. We do have one of his manuscripts for a masque, which was a type of play. And we have letters of almost every other writer of the period. But, Shakespeare wasn't just any other writer. He was one of greatness during his own lifetime. One literary critic said that if the muses could, if they spoke English, they would speak Shakespeare's English. So that was an enormous compliment during his lifetime. And yet, it's a big blank.
How do we date his work? Is there any, besides finding old, I was going to say menus, old, when you walk into a theater and they hand you a piece of paper, there's a word for it, and I can't think of it right now. My mind's blanked. Is there old posters perhaps around from when his plays were put on that we can accurately date, and therefore accurately date approximately when certain plays were written?
No,
Programs,
there's no programs. There's no manuscripts. They did have. There are some records by Henslow. He was a theater producer, and there are some Shakespeare plays listed in there, so we can get some idea of performance time, but only for a few of the plays. There's also printing. There were 16 individual Shakespeare plays printed, mostly during the Stratford man's lifetime, mostly during his lifetime. But that's pretty much all they have. And of course they have, as I mentioned earlier, the Stratford man's birth date and death date, and they kind of work with that. But it's very unwieldy. I mean, they have to fit about 40 plays in like an 18-year period or something. I don't know exactly. I can't do the math right now.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, in a very shorter 20-year period, say, they have to fit quite a few plays of top quality. Another playwright of the period, Christopher Marlowe, he wrote about 7 plays, but they conjecture it was done in about 7 years. So that's maybe 1 play a year. But Shakespeare, they have to average at least, I think, 2 or so. Marlowe's quality was not as high as Shakespeare. But I guess that's another question.
Do you feel that, was Shakespeare just one of the boys at the time, one of a bunch of playwrights? And I'll try and draw a modern analogy. Just another rock band, if you will, out on tour that only became famous like most artists after his death?
No, he was famous during his lifetime. He was first famous as a poet in 1593. That was the year that the name William Shakespeare first came in print, and it was on the dedication page of this poem called Venus and Adonis, which was a somewhat erotic poem. And that was a very popular poem, long poem, several pages long, and it was a sensation. It was reprinted, and several other writers imitated it right away within the next year. And then that next year, in 1594, he wrote another very famous work called Rape of Lucrece, and that too was imitated. So he was famous in his lifetime. His works were famous, but the man himself was mysterious. And that, again, brings us back to that it was a pen name.
When did he take on that iconic symbolism that we all have? There's a million Shakespeare sayings, and, I've even quoted him in my book on several times, Let Loose the Dogs of War and things of that nature. When did he become that icon? Was that after his death or during his lifetime?
Well, as I mentioned, during his lifetime, I mean, he was greatly praised. But when it really turned into something big was in 1623, when a very large collection of his plays was printed. And in this book, there were 20 new Shakespeare plays plays I had never seen print before. So this was a huge literary event. And in it was actually the very first acknowledgement that Shakespeare was dead, This was 7 years after the Stratford man had died. And Ben Jonson gives him a glowing tribute, a wonderful tribute. And that's it's also Ben Jonson who used the term Avon. He called Shakespeare Sweet Swan of Avon. And another poem in that book, in the preface, the tributes to Shakespeare, someone mentioned Thy Stratford Monument about Shakespeare. And so Stratford on one page, Avon on another page, and that's where it started, really, in my opinion, a myth that Shakespeare was from Stratford upon Avon. And it was really this book that was responsible. And this book, these opening pages, need to be looked at and examined more carefully. And you will see a lot of shenanigans going on and false information, in my opinion. Yes, and that's I analyze this in Shakespeare Suppressed.
There's a very famous picture. There are several very famous paintings of Shakespeare. Any idea who that person may be?
Yes, there's one at the National Portrait Gallery where he has an earring in his ear. That's kind of a very famous one. But if you ask the gallery, they'll tell you that there's no, they cannot prove 100% that this is a real image of Shakespeare. They don't know. And as there was also the well-known black and white image of Shakespeare in this book that I was describing. Today they call it the First Folio. Folio means the large page size, and first meaning it was the first edition of three subsequent, so this is the first of four. And that image is really the only, accepted image, as well as the one that's on the monument in Stratford upon Avon Church. So those are really the only two acknowledged ones, but both are very funny looking. The engraving has a very large forehead, which doesn't seem very natural. And also there is under his ear, there's a second line, there's two lines there, and it almost is an indication that it was actually a mask. You could read it that way if you look at it. And as far as the monument goes, there's an effigy, but there's documentary evidence that this monument was changed. The image was changed. And if you want, we can get into that more. But as far as Shakespeare's image, that too is a question. All we have are posthumous images, not during his lifetime images.
It sounds like portraits of Christ and things of that nature. Folks, totally enjoying this show. This is an incredible direction that we haven't gone before, and I'm so happy that Katherine Chiljan has graced us with her presence tonight, because we're talking about a Shakespeare conspiracy. Perhaps Shakespeare wasn't the person that we've grown up to believe he was. Perhaps it was just a pseudonym after all. And what better way to spend an evening, folks? Just chill out, get the coffee going, get a tea going, get a beverage of your choice going. Still a good solid hour and a half left of the show, folks. We're going to delve into more of the conspiracy. Chill out, relax, kick your feet back, get in your comfy chair. If it's cold out, get the coffee going. Obviously not in San Francisco, but if you're in Canada, it's damn cold these days. And it's a great time to buy a good book to read in the dark hours of the evening when the kids are asleep, or perhaps if you're a student and you're up late studying. The book is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. And of course, the guest tonight is Katherine Chiljan. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order it from the warm comfiness of your own home. How's that? Is that Shakespearean, Katherine? Not really.
Sort of.
Yeah, not so much. You know what? I think this adds validation to your theory. To think that there's an icon out there that was very popular in his own time. And I mean, icons always get portraits made of them. Somebody's always making a painting or a drawing of icons all the time. And yet we don't find any of William Shakespeare. And I find that absolutely bizarre. And I think that ties in with your whole thesis. Would you agree?
Yes, yes. it's because we have the wrong man. He wasn't from Stratford-on-Avon. He was a nobleman, very high up in the court. And we know this because of so many factors. I mean, let's first, if you want, look at the Shakespeare sonnets.
You must be clairvoyant, because that's where I was going with my next question. Is there any evidence in the sonnets themselves that perhaps Shakespeare was going to give you a little nudge?
Sonnet is like a 14-line poem, and Shakespeare wrote 154 of them, and they were printed in 1609. They're beautiful. They're superb examples of the most in the English language, some would say. But they're all written in the first person. So this is a very intimate, personal musing and speech of the great author, talking to himself, talking to others. One of them, like Sonnet 62, one line, he says, "Methinks no face so gracious is as mine." And the term here is gracious. And gracious, grace, or gracious was a term that Shakespeare used in his plays for high nobility or royalty. So he is saying that his face is gracious. He also mentioned, "Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy." So in other words, was it anything to me that I bore the canopy? Well, what is bearing the canopy? That meant only one thing during this period. That was to be one of the four people who held a pole that, with a canopy over it, over the queen, to walk with that as she is moving. That was considered a great honor. Someone who had to have been a high courtier or someone who was very distinguished would have that honor. And here he is saying that he did it. And actually he's saying, did it mean anything to me? So it means that wasn't really a big deal to him. It was just no big deal. Who else but kind of a disgruntled courtier would make a statement like that?
Do you think... Go ahead.
I was just going to say the great author was very intimately acquainted with aristocracy, the way they spoke and their customs and the sports that they were into, like falconry and tennis. Those weren't open. Those sports were not known to the general public. You had to have been someone who was moneyed and pretty high up to know about those details. He knew details of highly placed people, as we mentioned before, like Lord Burleigh and others. Another really fascinating thing is the condition of the plays. There's every evidence that the plays, the individual ones that were printed in his lifetime, were actually piracies. And that accords with the idea that Shakespeare was a nobleman's pen name, because he wouldn't have wanted his works to be published with his name or published at all during his lifetime, because that was the social norm of the time. If you were a nobleman or someone of high rank, what you're supposed to do is serve your country, serve your queen, by being a minister or being in the military, being in a responsible position. You're not supposed to frivol away your time writing plays or poetry. So it was something that was a social norm. You just don't publish during your lifetime. And there's lots of evidence that there was piracy involved with Shakespeare.
Do any letters still exist from the nobleman that can be compared to the writing style of Shakespeare?
That's a good question. I believe the Earl of Oxford was a true writer, and there has been a compilation of his letters and comparing to phrases in Shakespeare. And there are several that could be made, although a lot of these surviving letters of his were mostly business letters, so they're not going to be,
as flowery, so to speak.
Flowery and deeply poetic, like a love letter would or something,
When did he get off the island? When did his work start becoming known around the world?
Around the world, yeah. I believe in the early 17th century there were actors going to Germany and France giving some shade. There's evidence of that. So it was fairly early on. But they didn't have the type of communication we have today. But suffice it to say that during his lifetime, he was very popular. His plays were very popular.
You'd mentioned piracy before, and right away I thought if there might be any evidence that perhaps some of his plays have been altered over the years, in other words, added to, things taken out, of that nature.
Yes, I think it's certainly possible. Certainly for when the collection of plays came out in 1623, the First Folio, there was some degree of censorship. They had like new rules about vulgarity. So I think there were a few changes in that sense.
I've also heard people say that one of the reasons why a pseudonym was used was because the original writer was gay, and that was verboten, completely verboten in those days. Could there be any truth to that?
Well, you're looking at probably the sonnets, because so many of them were written, his love for a young man. Mm-hmm. In my interpretation, is that he was really addressing his son, the Earl of Southampton. But there are various theories about what is actually going on in the sonnets, who the Dark Lady is, and who the fair youth was. Mm-hmm. But I think that once we have the right author, if we accept the name was a pen name and that the author was somebody else, that's when these questions can start getting answered. But the Shakespeare establishment is so stubborn; they just will not look into it.
Let's talk about that right now as we speak. There's a tongue-in-cheek little mock trial going on at Stratford. They've put Shakespeare on trial, I think is the title of it. And basically what they're doing is they're trying to see if Shakespeare was Shakespeare, but more of a tongue-in-cheek. What's your perspective on things like this?
Yeah, I did watch it live streamed. I'm very glad that they gave attention to the authorship question, but they did, like you say, it was tongue-in-cheek. They were not really treating the idea seriously. It was scripted, and there was no new insights, and people were not really given. I understand they had a really good audiences, but I don't think they were given the full information, and that this is a very serious topic. This is a topic that several of our current Supreme Court justices and past ones have commented on and looked into.
What have they said?
There's been several mock trials. The Tennessee Law Review, a whole issue was devoted to this question. So very many distinguished, famous people have looked. Like,
can you tell us about that?
Freud. Several people believe there's problems with this.
Katherine, can you tell us about that? Because this is news to me. I wasn't aware of that.
Aware of
the trial, the trial in Tennessee.
Oh, it wasn't a trial. It was a law review, the Tennessee Law Review.
Okay, and
a journal,
right.
And the entire issue. I can't tell you the year. It was about 5 years ago or so. The entire issue was devoted to the Shakespeare authorship question. This is a topic that lawyers love, because it's all about evidence. Mm-hmm. The case for the Stratford man as a great author is entirely posthumous after his death. There's no evidence during his lifetime that he's a great author. That's what this whole controversy is all about.
I'm going to try and draw a parallel here now between this conspiracy and the Kennedy conspiracy, because it's one I'm closer to, of course, is the Kennedy one. And mainstream refuses to get, if you will, an opposite view out to the people. They keep doing the same thing over and over again. Even, the anniversary's coming up again. It's almost upon us, November 22nd. And it's the same thing. Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and that's it, even though there's so much evidence to counter that argument. I mean, scientific evidence at this point. The crime scene investigators looked at the Zapruder film using 21st century crime scene techniques that weren't available in 1963, and she has found a frontal shot. Now, a frontal shot, folks, means two shooters.
Yeah.
Two shooters means conspiracy. I think we're grown up enough now to handle it. Do you feel the mainstream is still downplaying the fact that Shakespeare might be just a pseudonym? And if so, why would they stick to something it doesn't seem to really have any relevance either way?
It's, I don't know, I think there's some psychological issue going on with both of our topics where, once something gains, strength, well, I'm trying to find the word, but anyway, when something is generally accepted, it takes a lot to tear it down. It's odd because every academic discipline, like history, linguistics, lawyers, doctors, you name it, every list in academic, you can find supporters of this notion that there's reason to doubt the Stratford man as the great author, except one group of people, and those are English professors, and they just will not look at the case. They will not. They rather make things up, which is, to me, most Shakespeare biographies are filled with much speculation instead of hard fact. And they need to revisit their case. And even, I came across a line by Carl Sagan. He said, if there's nothing to support your theory, you should abandon it, in essence. And that's what they should do. Nothing supports their theory, so they should abandon it. They just can't seem to accept the idea that there were two people named William Shakespeare, one being a pen name and one being a man born with that name, who was the Stratford man. Two people with that name involved in the theater. That's the concept that they just need to try and understand. And it's not so remote an idea because during this period there were two men named John Davies, who were both poets and both lived at roughly the same time. And today scholars still mix up which poem belongs to which John Davies. So it's not that hard a concept, and I just wish that they would look into it because, their lives would be so much more enriched if they are dealing with the right author instead of the Stratford man, who, if you look at the facts about the Stratford man, they're very banal, they're very boring. I mean, he's accused of grain hoarding. He tries to reclaim his money-lending loans. He sells stone and grain. I mean, these are like the nuggets that we've got that has been left down to us. There's nothing colorful, at all, other than him being a member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men, and being a Globe Theatre shareholder. It's just business. That's all we have about the Stratford man is business.
And that's it. Is your goal then to bring out the real person behind Shakespeare, perhaps the Earl of Oxford, and somehow bring truth to the whole narrative and find out more about what made this creative genius?
Yes, of course. That's one of the many reasons why this is important, because we're going to get when we know his true life, and we'll know what inspired All's Well That Ends Well or Othello. We'll know what was going on in his life when he wrote that. And we'll get more insight. And there's people all around the world who love Shakespeare, and they buy these biographies of the Stratford man, but they can't possibly be satisfied because it's all speculation, 90% of it, they need the full information. That's what my book's all about. I mean, we should know. And people should know that the Stratford man never claimed to be the great author, and neither did his children, and neither did his grandchild.
He was just thrust into the limelight.
And like you said, you had asked me earlier, did anyone interview him? No. And yet, if you ask the professor, he was in retirement the last 2-3 years of his life. Well, why didn't people go to Stratford-on-Avon and interview him and talk to him? It was quite the opposite. In fact, the town of Stratford, one of those years, banned players from coming to the town So that's a weird thing. You mentioned Mozart too.
Yeah.
I was surprised to learn that an English couple, I think about 20 or 30 years after his death, actually made a pilgrimage to talk to his sister and his wife, and they did, and they recorded what they had to say about Mozart. Of course, that was a little bit later, but there were biographies during Shakespeare's time, and antiquarians during Shakespeare's time. Of course, there was interest, but nothing was recorded.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to figure out when he got off island. I know it was after his death, but usually if something new comes along, the first thing you're going to do besides Google it these days, folks, would have been do a little bit of research and try and find out the history of such an icon. And there's nothing that there's any evidence that any of that ever took place. And that's just absolutely bizarre, folks. The book is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. Katherine Chiljan's our guest tonight. She's the author of the book, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Katherine, how was his work groundbreaking? What made him that icon? What set him apart? What was the thing that primarily set him apart from all the other authors of that time?
Well, it's his most beautiful language in the world. I mean, the most beautiful sounds. I mean, you speak a Shakespeare passage, and it's like music. And they recognize this. As I mentioned, the critics said if the muses spoke English, they would speak Shakespeare lines. That's a very high tribute. He was also, what also sets him apart is the incredible amount of knowledge that is displayed in the work. So we haven't even gotten into that.
We will for sure.
Yeah. Do you want to do that now, or?
Well, we can't. But I just want to clarify for the students that are listening. Was there one play in particular that broke him above the other? I'm going to use the music analogy again for the students that are listening. There's always that first album that's okay, but there's a second or third album that really breaks the artist into the multinationals and right around the globe. Was there one play in particular that really launched his career?
Well, that's hard to say because we really don't know what the first play was that he wrote, or we don't know what the last play was that he wrote.
So we don't even know the chronological.
Yeah, we don't have the chronology. That's another consequence of not having an author. But I think scholars today would probably point to Hamlet as being, so psychological. And maybe Macbeth too.
Oh, I love Macbeth.
I think Howard Bloom used the term. It was the title of his book. The Shakespeare, the Invention of a Human, where he really laid out what it is to be a human being. What's going on in his mind. And so many different characters, of all different types of characters, like Falstaff and colorful people. I mean, he just. That's a great line James Joyce wrote. After God, Shakespeare created most. So
that's a beautiful tribute, isn't it?
Yes, it sure is. And I mean, imagine these plays are over 400 years old, and yet every day, somewhere in the world, someone is performing them, or someone is reading Shakespeare plays in all different languages. It's a huge tribute.
Absolutely. And folks, by the way, when plays of Shakespeare are performed now, they're usually truncated because plays in those days could be 4, 5, 6, 7 hours sometimes. And do his plays in their entirety exist somewhere, and are they ever performed, to your knowledge?
Well, I believe like Hamlet would probably be one of the longest, because I think they say it would go to about 5 hours if you did the entire version.
Yeah, don't forget too, folks. There was no YouTube, there was no television in those days. This was your entertainment for the whole day. That was the deal. So that's one of the reasons why plays were so long. I'm trying to bring the students into understanding that. I went to see a movie last night called Annabelle, and a few of them said, "Well, why didn't the person was looking up some information about the devil?" And I heard a young girl behind me say, the movie takes place in the 60s, by the way, folks. I had a young girl behind me said, "Why didn't you just Google it?" And I laughed because, anyways. So do you think part of that reigns true to today?
I'm sorry, about what? I'm sorry.
Well, about students and, today's generation just doesn't understand that the in-depth profoundness of his work and how detailed it was and the effort it took to make such a masterpiece.
Well, I don't know what the curriculum is in Canada, but I would say that most high schools here in the U.S., you do read a Shakespeare play. I read Julius Caesar in 10th grade. I think that anyone who opens a page of Shakespeare and sees, tries to read it, of course they're going to have a little bit of a hard time. But the more you read it, the easier it gets. But Shakespeare was responsible for at least 2,000 words, inventing 2,000 words. He had a vocabulary of 17,000 of unique words, and I think close to almost double that of words with variants. So yeah, he was deeply knowledgeable.
Katherine, can you give us an example of maybe one or two words that he invented, quote unquote?
Yes, lackluster, eyeball.
He invented eyeball?
Successful. Foregone conclusion. At last gasp. Submerge. These are just a few. Gloomy.
That's
lonely.
Incredible. So a true genius creates something from nothing, virtually.
That's what they'll tell you.
That's what they'll tell you.
But a lot of these words were that he invented were from Latin and Greek roots. So he was very
well educated
into linguistics and etymology.
Do we know where the Earl of Oxford went to school? Right away,
yes,
I think Oxford. Don't tell me Oxford.
The enrollment records at Cambridge and Oxford universities do survive, and there's no William Shakespeare, but there is Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. He was enrolled in Cambridge, I believe, when he was 8. That was very young even back then. And he got his bachelor's degree, and then when he was 12, he went to Oxford, and in 1566, he was 16, he got his master's degree. And after that, he went straight to law school.
Now, at 16, was that common in those days? Certainly not now.
I mean, there were some going young like that, but starting at 8 was really something special. He also had several tutors when he was a child. And we have a record of one of his tutors saying, we've taught him everything that we know. And he was very young. He was 12 or 13. So he was a prodigy. There was no doubt about that.
Wow.
Then he went to law school. And
so he was an underachiever, is what you're trying to tell me.
Yeah, he was amazing.
Do we know much about his offspring and their offspring and on down the line and how they feel today?
You mean for the Earl of Oxford?
Yes.
Yes. He had a lot of scandals in his life, and when his wife died, his first wife died, it appears that his 3 daughters, you might think of King Lear, but his 3 daughters were put under the care of their grandfather. So he's gotten a bad rap for that. And so it's interesting that his children and his grandchildren never named their children after him, Edward. So I think that was a degree of scandal. And this is reflected in the sonnets too, the autobiographical sonnets, where he mentions that his name was stained, that he was disgraced. So you get into that, and there are some of his descendants today. One of them, I think he was a collateral descendant, is Charles Burford, and he has written a book about this called Shakespeare's Lost Kingdom. That came out a couple of years ago. And he also gave several lectures across America about the authorship topic. But yeah, there's not a lot of, it's been 400 years, so.
Yeah, I was just wondering if perhaps the family themselves may have a quest, if you will, to clarify that indeed their great-great-great-great-grandfather was in fact William Shakespeare.
Yeah, well, Charles Beauclerc, if you look him up, he is a relative. He's not a direct descendant, but certainly a relative. And one day he will be a duke. His father is the Duke of St. Albans. So,
would he be the Duke of Earl? No, okay, bad joke. Folks, you got to have a little bit of fun sometimes, right? I mean, we're always with doom and gloom and stuff. Folks, fascinating subject matter tonight. We're coming up to break in just a few seconds. The book is called Shakespeare Suppressed. There's the uncensored truth about Shakespeare and his work. When we come back, we're going to be looking at the information contained into the sonnets that may indeed identify who the real William Shakespeare is, right here on Night Fright. Stick with us. 6 minutes from now, we'll be back. Stick with us, Katherine. And we are back, folks. Welcome back to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. Solid hour left, folks, and you want to listen to this one. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Katherine Chiljan. She's got a book out called Shakespeare Suppressed. We are indeed talking about a Shakespeare conspiracy tonight, folks. And the evidence that Katherine's put forward is uncanny. Shakespeare Suppressed is the name of the book, The Uncensored Truth about Shakespeare and his works. I just want to thank very much another host of a show. Mark Eddy has a show here on Revolution Radio as well. And he suggested Katherine. And I was a little bit nervous. I said, okay, maybe not. But Mark convinced me that Katherine was dynamite. And she is explosive, folks. She's just smoking tonight. She's telling us all the information that she has compiled over the years to prove that William Shakespeare was none other than the Earl of Oxford. And we're going to be going into that in just a few seconds. We're going to be looking specifically at the information contained within Shakespeare's actual sonnets that lead us to believe that this is indeed the case, that there was a conspiracy behind all of this. First of all, though, I want to thank Kelly Lowe. Kelly, thank you so much, my friend. I know you're listening right now. Kelly, folks, puts all the shows up on iTunes, and they're all free, by the way. All this stuff is free. I don't make a dime off this show. He puts the shows up on iTunes for you to download. He puts them up on the website for you to download. He keeps the whole website together full of pertinent information. He just does a bang-up, absolutely fantastic job. And again, he's a volunteer. He doesn't get anything out of this, and he just from the goodness of his heart. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, Kelly, to you. Thank you so much. I have to plug my book right now. The book is called The JFK Assassination from the Oval Office to DEALEY Plaza. Now, I'm just going to read you very quickly. It's because it's so funny and coincidental that we are indeed talking about William Shakespeare tonight, because chapter 1 of my book, I use to introduce several paragraphs in it, actual quotes from William Shakespeare's sonnets. And just let me read it very quickly. This is the preface. The most bizarre thing happened in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963. That was the day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It stopped raining. Now you'd think, given the horror and evil that were about to unfold, that huge black storm clouds, gale force winds, thunder, and lightning would be whipped up into a cinematic frenzy. Instead, the clouds parted as if on cue, and then the sun came out, basking the whole city in glorious sunlight and warmth. And so it began. Now, this is a quote from Shakespeare that I use to introduce the next paragraph. The devil can cite scripture for his purpose. In the next few hours, days, some would argue right up into today, would seem controlled by the gods of fate themselves. In truth, a better analogy would be the devil himself, dutifully following a script ripped right out of the book of Revelations. Something wicked this way comes. It had poured all morning in Dallas where the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, on board Air Force One, was about to touch down. If the raging storm had indeed continued, Air Force One would have been, at the very least, diverted, waiting for the storm to subside. It would have resulted in delaying or maybe even canceling the scheduled motorcade. A motorcade carrying the President of the United States that was destined to inch through the streets of downtown Dallas with the crowds 5, sometimes 6 deep, finally making that unorthodox turn into Dealey Plaza and past the Texas Schoolbook Depository. Hell is empty and all the devils are here. Unfortunately, Air Force One came about and landed safe and sound. The President of the United States, husband and father, had but minutes left to live. And I'm just going to jump to the last paragraph. There's a whole bunch more. Like a fountain with 100 spouts did run pure blood. That's another quote from William Shakespeare. However, the 120-degree turn onto Elm forced the motorcade to slow almost to a standstill. The President of the United States had unknowingly just entered the kill zone. JFK had seconds to live. Every time I see the film footage of the motorcade, I just want to reach out back into the past and stop the motorcade and change the outcome of those 6 seconds that rang out. However, such is never to be the case. Out of shame, the morning sun would never show itself again to President Kennedy. Then the first shot rang out. And that's from chapter 1 of my new book, folks, called JFK Assassination, From the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza, www.nightfrightshow.com. Folks, settle in. We have a full hour left. We're looking at a Shakespeare conspiracy. And you know, the parallels are alarming in all conspiracies. There's always that cover-up. And why is there a cover-up? What evidence is there to prove that there was a cover-up? What evidence is there to prove that what we have taken for the gospel, if you will, is indeed nothing but a pack of lies? And that's what we're going to look at now with Katherine Chiljan, who's joining us all the way from San Francisco. Katherine, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again in the second hour.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Can we derive any information, any revelations, if you will, from the sonnets themselves that William Shakespeare wrote, or should I say the Earl of Oxford wrote?
Yes. As we mentioned before, a good portion of the sonnets are addressed to a beautiful young man. And over and over, he uses terms of royalty, like the sun and royal terms, addressing him as if he was somebody higher than himself. Now, if you believe he was the Earl of Oxford, he had a very high title. He was an Earl, and he was the 17th of his family, and he was one of the highest-ranked noblemen in the land, next to the Queen. And here he's addressing this young man as someone that he needs to give his duty to. And if you look at the imagery, you can see that he believed, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but he believed that this young man was a prince. And actually, there are several references to the Earl of Southampton in similar terms by other writers of the period, where they refer to him as a prince. And I do get into this in the last 2 chapters of my book. But the idea that he was possibly a prince would mean that he was the Queen Elizabeth I's child, and of course she was famous as being the Virgin Queen. She'd never married. So how can you reconcile that point with what her image was? And Shakespeare, if you read him right, you can see that undermines that image.
You know, it's funny. I was talking about the parallels between the Kennedy conspiracy. Now, all of a sudden, I feel like we're talking about Christ and Mary Magdalene having a kid. You know, the Virgin. You know what I'm saying? It's that explosive. Could this again contribute to one of the reasons why the cover-up? And you know, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and it's probably preposterous, but is there a possibility that the royal family is trying to cover this up, and they're putting some weight on it to keep that myth alive that the first Queen Elizabeth was indeed a virgin?
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay, it was preposterous. But that's where we go on Night Fright, folks. We go right out there on the edge.
It's a fair question, considering what they say about what happened with Diana, but which I don't subscribe to anyway.
Me either.
But yes, I believe you hit the nail on the head. I believe that it was the sonnets that was the reason for the cover-up. They knew about a man with a similar name to the pen name, and they diverted the authorship to that man so that the very sonnets would not be read in this light. If people read the sonnets knowing that they were written by the Earl of Oxford, they would look at them a little bit differently than they would from a man with humble beginnings, who they all believe is just an actor who is, writing for money, basically. And they would see them in a different light. And the same is true for some of the plays. As I mentioned, there were some caricatures of very highly placed people, like Lord Burleigh and Robert Cecil and Christopher Hatton. These are all top men during the Queen's lifetime. So, I do think that has something to do with it.
You know, I'm a writer myself. I just, I'm unashamedly just give a little bit of a plug to my book and stuff. And I hang out at Starbucks to write. Is there any evidence that good old Will, the Earl of Oxford, if you will, hung out at a specific spot to write?
Well, no, there isn't. But the Earl of Oxford was a great patron of the arts, and he patronized several writers. John Lilly was a playwright of the period. Anthony Munday was a playwright of the period, and they were both working for him, the Earl of Oxford. And he patronized historians and people who wanted to make translations out of other languages, stories. He sponsored those. He sponsored musicians. William Byrd was one of the musicians. Wow. He had his own acting troupes, too. He had two or three acting troupes.
I guess what I was trying to imply, Katherine, with that question was, given the risk to him, perhaps he traveled to a cottage, or perhaps he traveled overseas to Europe and only did his writing there, but I guess there's no evidence of that either.
No, and I don't think it was the case. I think that he was around literary people.
Right.
And we have the evidence of that. Writers of the period refer to him, knowing him. So if you saw a movie, Anonymous, which came out the same year as my book, 2011, they depict the Earl of Oxford as Shakespeare, but they depict him as someone who was isolated and in the dark, which was not the case. He was involved with the theater. I mean, we know he has had some theater troupes. We know that he took out a lease on another theater, the Blackfriars Theater. We know that he employed playwrights. Mm-hmm. So he was involved. He wasn't just in isolation. I mean, he probably wrote these plays, in his home, but they were all written anonymously without any author name attached.
Would that make it easier for him then, because he was a patron of the arts? Would that make it easier for him to introduce a William, quote unquote, William Shakespeare play. His buddy William Shakespeare gave me this play. I'd like you to produce it. That type of scenario.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again? I'm not quite
Sure. I'm trying to figure out how the plays got from this fictional character, William Shakespeare, into the hands of people who could produce it. And I'm just thinking that if the Earl of Oxford was indeed a patron of the saints, isn't that funny? A patron of the arts, and perhaps was a producer in his own right, if he could just hand off a William Shakespeare play to perhaps a director that is under his employment and say, here's another one of those plays from good old Will. I'd like you to produce it.
I don't think it went that way. I think
Okay.
I think that you have to keep in mind that these plays were initially, in my opinion, written for Queen Elizabeth I and her court, and they debuted there. I've done a lot of research recently. There are records of the entertainments before the Queen, and many of them describe characters or themes of Shakespeare plays. Like, for example, in 1567 or 68, there was a play about the King of Scots, which could be an early form of Macbeth, and this was performed before the Queen. It had taken place shortly after the murder, the assassination of Lord Darnley in Scotland.
How would directors get a
kind of
hold?
relevant.
How would directors get a hold of Shakespeare's plays?
That's a good question. I'm not 100% sure, but I know that when it could be that he gave them parts to play. I don't think they ever had the whole plays, but he perhaps gave them parts to play, and then these parts got passed on to other companies. Yeah, I really haven't delved into that. I don't know 100%, but I do know that they were initially performed. If you really delve into what was performed before the Queen, it appears that they were initially written for her, and then later went to the public theater. But people have to keep in mind that the Queen never attended a public theater. She only had her own private entertainments.
Her own private theater.
Yeah, with her courtiers.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Earl of Oxford is on record performing before her.
Wow.
Yeah, when he was 22.
Do you think any linkage between Queen Elizabeth and her perceived son of the Earl of Oxford may indeed still exist, perhaps in the archives, somewhere deep in the bowels of wherever the archives are held in Britain? A paper trail?
You mean that the Queen had a child?
Yeah, perhaps a paper trail somewhere.
I don't think so.
Okay.
This would be highly classified information. Only people very, very close to her would know what happened.
Okay.
In that sense.
Maybe it's held at Area 51. Who knows?
Yeah, but in the last two chapters of my book, I do present evidence that seemed to the Earl of Southampton it appears to have been treated like he was a prince or like he was somebody with great expectation. And why is that the case? It seems odd. Yeah. And when he was only, I believe, 17 years old, he was nominated as the Knight of the Garter, which was probably one of the highest honors that one could get back then. And only people with distinguished service to the crown, or if you were a royal, would be nominated for that award. And he was, and yet he had nothing to show for it. So and scholars have all wondered why that was the case. I mean, he did not win the nomination, but the actual title, but he was nominated for it.
Wow.
Very odd.
Is there a physical place, is there a grave site that people go and visit that is supposed to be William Shakespeare?
Well, yes, it's in the Stratford upon Avon Church. There's a monument to Shakespeare. But that's another crazy aspect of this authorship.
Tell us.
Yeah, I mean,
I love this stuff.
if you look in the First Folio book, there's a reference to the Stratford monument, and lo and behold, if you go to Stratford-on-Avon, there is a monument to Shakespeare, except it's not to William Shakespeare, it's to Shakespeare, just Shakespeare. And there is an effigy of a man holding a pen and a piece of paper, but somebody made a drawing of this monument about 18 years after the Stratford man had died. And it did not picture a man holding a pen and paper. It was a man holding a sack of some sort. And he had a long mustache, not an upturned mustache like today's. There's several discrepancies between today's monument and the one that existed soon after the Stratford man had died. And there's every appearance that it actually had been changed. I believe the original monument was to the Stratford man's father, John, who was a dealer in wool. And so the sack that this original monument was holding, it was probably a sack of wool. And I have a whole chapter on this in the book. Nowhere in the inscription does it say that this was a writer, at least in the English inscription. It's another mystery.
It's another mystery. I wonder even if there's indeed anybody buried under that monument. Maybe it's just an empty grave.
Well, that's the weird thing. I mean, the monument, which is on the wall, it says, placed within this monument is Shakespeare. And yet, on the floor of the church area, a few feet away, is supposedly the grave of Shakespeare. And yet, there's no identification on it. All it has is a curse. It says, "Cursed be he who moves my bones." But there's this long-standing tradition that Shakespeare is buried there, which is another oddity about Shakespeare. Where is he? Is he in the ground there, or is he in the monument?
Is it more of an oral tradition that's passed down from generation to generation?
It must have been. Otherwise, how could they identify it?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
It has no name on it.
It's absolutely bizarre, isn't it?
And I tend to think that it was purposely done so that the Stratford man, the actual body of the Stratford man, would not be exhumed and reburied in Westminster Abbey, which is, it was even discussed back then that he should be moved to Westminster Abbey. But I think that they purposely put two conflicting inscriptions so he would not be removed.
That makes perfect sense to me. If you're trying to throw people off, then what you need is a distraction. And
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, is there a known grave for the Earl of Oxford? Would you know that?
Well, there was, but in the 18th century, the church that he was buried in was torn down, rebuilt. So we don't know exactly where. There is a tomb of the De Veres in Westminster Abbey, his cousins, Francis and Horace. And there is one grave contained in there that's unidentified. And we think it's possible that he was removed to Westminster Abbey in the De Vere tomb. But unfortunately, we can't open it. I think we need the Queen's approval, today's Queen's approval, to open it.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be forthcoming real soon.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Now, it's curious because very often what happens, as we know today, with old graveyards and old graves, once the third or fourth generation of the deceased has passed away themselves, very few people go and visit old graveyards. So, you think of your great-grandkids. How often great-grandchildren have you ever visited your great-grandfather's gravesite or great-grandmother's gravesite? I would probably be on the safe side as betting that very few, maybe 1 to 3%. So essentially what they do with old graveyards, as we've come to know, is leave the bodies there but remove the tombstones and just build on that, usually a park or something like that. A great example of this and this is not to creep anybody out, I originally hailed from Montreal, and right downtown Montreal, there's a park there called Dominion Park, and it's the site of an old graveyard. And at least once or twice a year, you'll have people sitting outside eating their lunches in the summertime, and all of a sudden a little finger will come poking at them. And what it is, of course, is the coffins have faded away now at this point, and as the earth changes, well, bones rise to the surface. So they find these bones. It's nothing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of creepy to think it's in downtown Montreal. But this was the site of Montreal's second graveyard, and of course, as cities expand, and I'm sure everywhere you go, you're going to find something like this. They just found a lost graveyard in Ottawa, not far from the Parliament building. They were digging up an old street and found all these graves, and sure enough, they checked the records, and this is only a couple of hundred years ago, folks. We're talking, because Canada's not that hasn't got an extensive history, unlike Britain. That they found all these old graves, and of course they finally removed the remains and put them in a proper burial spot. But this goes on all the time, so I'm sure that to try and find where these bodies were is going to be quite difficult at this point, especially if there's no records that have been kept. And that's the mystery behind it all, isn't it, Catherine? Is the lack of records. I mean, Time magazine, when we came into the new millennium, declared that the man of the millennium, the previous millennium, was William Shakespeare. And to think there's no records of this absolute international icon, the man of the millennium, is absolutely bizarre.
Yeah, it's scandalous. But you know what? There is evidence of who he was. Contemporaries did write about the great author, but they did so in an indirect way, almost in code, when they referred to him. And I have a whole chapter giving these citations of what contemporaries, while he was alive, what they were saying about him. And if you read them in the right light, you can see that they're referring to him as a man of high rank, that he wrote anonymously or under a shadow, they would say, or that he was using a pen name. They mentioned that he wrote plays much earlier than we believed, that now he was well known to university students, that he was dead by 1607, things like this. But of course, again, this is not like open remarks. They're kind of hidden in symbolism. Like, for example, one was referred to William Shakespeare. They used the term William Shakespeare. They referred to him as our English Terence. And Terence was a classical reference to a Roman playwright during the period. And it was believed that during Shakespeare's time, that Terence was actually a front for two noblemen who were writers. And so by outwardly saying to our English Terence, William Shakespeare, I mean, he in essence was saying, this is a pen name. And there's several other instances like that. And so what to me is I don't understand is why today's professors don't look at this evidence. Here it's clear as a day. It's in print. And it was during his lifetime. Why don't they pay attention to this?
Let's talk about that.
To me, it's almost as if they're perpetuating a fraud.
Oh, I think they are completely.
By ignoring this type of evidence.
Have you been ostracized because of your book?
No, not really. I'm just basically ignored, I guess, by them.
So you've never been asked to come into an English department or a drama department and give a lecture on your research?
Not after my book was written, no.
Yeah, so you've been ostracized. I would call that ostracization. How are you when you start talking to an academic that doesn't know you have a book out and is in firm belief that Shakespeare was indeed a real historical figure? How do they react when you start telling them your research?
Well, I haven't met too many. I'm pretty much an independent researcher. I'm not affiliated with a university. I mean, I went to UCLA. I had a bachelor's degree from UCLA in history. But yeah, I mean, when I would go there, I would talk to old professors about this, and they would just run away from the issue. They really don't want to talk about it. And one of them was a very distinguished history professor, and he seemed to think that, the great author could pick up all sorts of topics just from like going to a tavern, and I couldn't believe that he would make that type of statement, that you can pick up, ancient Greek, in a tavern, or French or Italian, and it's not logical. These type of topics are not taught at the grammar school. And
I don't dispute.
Knowledge was.
I don't dispute in any sense that you could pick something up from a tavern, especially in those days. But I don't think it would be anything educational.
Or deep. And
Or deep,
his
yeah.
knowledge was very deep. I mean, he knew ancient Greek, he knew Latin, he knew rhetoric. Rhetoric was only taught at university level.
Once again, a well-educated person.
Yeah, he knew medicine. Medicine was not taught at a local grammar school. There's only over 600 references, medical references.
I've got to ask a couple of questions just because it's Night Fright. The Earl of Oxford, was he a Mason?
No, I don't think they existed back then.
Fair enough. And have you heard of the Oak Island mystery?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any truth to this one? That good old Will is perhaps buried there, and he's part of the mystery of that big hole in the middle of the island?
Yeah, I think it's a possibility. I mean, something.
Really?
Well, I mean, it has been bandied about, but I mean, it had to be something really amazing buried in there for them to dig so many, tunnels and engineering, feats of engineering. It's got to be something really special. But there's no way to know. I mean, have they? I mean, I haven't heard about it lately. Have you? I mean,
there was a whole. I think what was ever there has long been washed out to sea, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we're ever going to find it, to be honest with you. And it's one of those mysteries. It's like Loch Ness, I hope we never do, because there are certain mysteries in the world that I would like to keep mysteries. So that's one of them, the lost treasure and things like that. This, however, is a conspiracy, and that's different. I would like to find out the truth behind this and give the correct person the credit that person so much deserves, and clarify history.
Exactly.
It's historical, folks, and because of that, we have to be accurate. It's okay to romance it, Shakespeare in Love and all the other ones, and there's no problem. I have no problems with movies and things like that, but this is history, and I think we have to be accurate in the same sense that we have to be accurate with the JFK assassination. And there's, some similar parallels without question. I think it's far easier to research the JFK assassination than the work Katherine's done, that's for sure, because with the lack of records. What is your main source when you're researching? What was your main source that you went to, and what were some of the new ones that you've exposed?
Well, Shakespeare scholarship has been going on for over 200 years, and there was a lot of great scholarship. It's just the biography that they just kept coming up to a stone wall, and they discovered a lot of things about the theater during the period and the history during the period, and of course they've analyzed the plays in great depth, and they come to some they amazing conclusions sometimes where they think that the play was written like a given play much earlier than believed, but they hesitate and they say, no, it can't be, because the Stratford man wasn't born yet, or he was 5 years old, or something like that. So, I mean, I basically culled a lot of information from, regular Shakespeare scholars over the past 200 years. I just have my own spin on it because I have a vision of who the real author was, so I think I can see a little bit clearer for their evidence. So I've been able to kind of advance their own evidence in a way. One great thing I did was try and bring out a new chronology of the plays, from early references to some of the famous lines, like "to be or not to be," that are sprinkled in the literature from the 1570s, 1580s, 1590s, onwards, which can date the plays. Like, for example, what I just said, "to be or not to be," there is a reference to that in 1593.
Is there really?
And yet, the professor will tell you, oh, the play wasn't written until 1600, So these type of things get ignored. And that's the problem. I mean, there's been no advance to my knowledge of Shakespeare scholarship for the last 50 years. It's all the advances have been made by people like me, who are we call ourselves anti-Stratfordians, who are not constricted by the Stratford man model.
You ever thought of approaching, you mentioned that you went to the University of California, Los Angeles, and have a BA in history. Have you ever thought about approaching them about a thesis, a PhD thesis on this subject matter?
No, I haven't. I did try and get into a master's program up here at Berkeley, but the major, they only let about 20 students in a year, so it wasn't good for me, but I had to make a living.
I hear you, my friend. Everybody thinks that you're an author, and I'm gonna tell you straight.
I'm having trouble getting into the alumni magazine. I've tried.
Me too.
Several times, and they won't even.
What the hell is that about?
Mention my book.
Yes. You and I have very similar paths because of I've tried with my alumni, my University of Montreal, Concordia, and I can't get the time of day from them. I'm living in a place called Kingston with Queen's University, which is kind of an Ivy League university in Canada. I'm right here. They won't even offer me a lecture, and I offered to do it for free on the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and it's like, oh, no, verboten, we can't touch this. So you're running into the same roadblocks.
Oh, yeah. I was going to give a talk at a public library about this topic.
Yes.
The problem was, and they seemed very interested, the library people, but they had one of their sponsors was a nearby theater, very big theater, and they told them about it, and they, in essence, put a kibosh on it because they don't believe in the authorship. They don't want anything to do with the authorship question. I was going to give a free lecture with slides and everything, historical talk, really. And who are they to influence something presented at a public library? So
it's freedom of thought. To start the dialogue and let's see where it goes. And this is not threatening at all to national security or anything else.
Would think so.
Maybe somebody's ego, but that's about all. And maybe that's what comes into play with these things more often than not. Folks, the book is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Work. And the book is written by Katherine Chiljan, who's our guest tonight, www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book. And this is a great book for you to read at this time of year. The nights are getting longer, the days shorter. What a bummer that is, let me tell you. And colder. So get the fireplace going, sit back and put your feet up. Terrific book to take you on a nice little journey and to get you thinking about all those things that we take for granted. Years ago, we used to think the earth was flat, and some people still do. Some people think that's a conspiracy as well. But this one, I think, makes a lot of sense. I think Katherine's done outstanding research, and I'm kind of on her side with this one, without question. Once again, the book is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Work, www.nightfrightshow.com. Will there be a book 2, Katherine? Is there new evidence that has come to light since
I haven't stopped collecting more evidence. But
what have you found out?
It took me a while to put it all together.
Okay.
This book took me 6.5 years.
Oh, I hear you. What revelations have you found out since the release of this previous book?
I found more references to Shakespeare plays presented to Queen Elizabeth. As far as the record shows, there were maybe 2 or 3. But I've come across a total of about 19. So that, again, makes it very odd why there was no anecdotes or any correspondence between the Queen and the great Shakespeare. And it makes, to me, it's more affirmation that it was someone in her circle, one of her noblemen.
With the more and more things are being uncovered all the time. And do you think there's any works that may have been suppressed to the point that they were never made public that may yet find the daylight?
I certainly think it's possible. We have 154 sonnets, so there could have been more, as far as we know. And as I mentioned, I believe most of the plays that we have were actual piracies. And we never really have read the real Shakespeare plays. I think that the great author had them in his possession, and he deposited them somewhere. I don't know where. But readers and fans alike, they have to know that the plays that they read today have been augmented over the years. They've been edited, and they've been cleaned up a great deal. If you read Romeo and Juliet that was printed in 1597, you would be clueless. There's so many inaccuracies and missing material and things like that. That's true for a lot of the plays. So
you mean they found all that other material?
The real Shakespeare plays. Where are they?
Yeah, exactly.
That is the holy grail.
No kidding. And I suspect, once it's written down, then there's a hard copy. And we know darn well that it would survive under the right conditions. And certainly those conditions exist in ancient Britain, without question. And I mean, we know the Magna Carta is still around and all kinds of things like that date beforehand. So exactly where is that archive? Where is that treasure trove? Be interesting to find out. I mean,
every day I hope it's going to unfold itself somewhere. It will at some point. That's my great hope.
That's a great hope. So you continue on with the research. New revelations are presenting themselves all the time. What do you tell the youth of today? What would you say to them? Is it relevant to the actual works themselves that we know who actually wrote them, or should they just sit back and enjoy the work for the work?
I think that if they look into the authorship question, which will lead them to the Earl of Oxford, and they read the life of the Earl of Oxford, I think they're going to understand the works a lot easier because they're going to have a biography to match it against. Like, for example, Othello. Othello, the husband is jealous of the wife, and he believes that she was unfaithful. Well, that was a theme in about 4 Shakespeare plays. What was it? What happened in the great author's life where he had such, must have had something similar for him to keep treating it in several plays? Well, if you looked at the Earl of Oxford's life, you'll see that he had the same situation. He took a grand tour of Europe, and on his way back, someone told him that his child was born later than he had believed, and that therefore the child was not his. And he separated himself from his wife without even talking to her about it. He just left her. And it's similar parallels, and you're going to get all sorts of parallels like that with all of the plays if you look at his life. Of course, Hamlet is really the Earl of Oxford's life in many ways. So yes, I would, and you're going to understand the sonnets better too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would highly recommend people get into it.
I actually have one of the things I actually have is a theater degree as a lighting designer, and of course, on the curriculum, without hesitation, well, from high school on, of course, there always has to be a Shakespeare. And you had mentioned it was much the same thing for you growing up. Was there a play in particular that attracted you to William Shakespeare?
Well, the first play I read was Hamlet, and I loved it. I was so impressed by the language and how introspective he was. And And also, Othello really affected me too. I cried reading it. So, yeah, I mean, but this was before I knew about the authorship question.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm just
and
trying
now
to.
I read it, and it just comes alive, you know.
It
So
just has
I
all that
wrote
with
this book so people would get the full information about him instead of what they've been, you know, told, which is really not much, actually. I mean,
Is there a play now that you gravitate more to besides Hamlet than the others?
Yeah, no, I can't say. I can't. I think it's still Hamlet.
Okay. Have you seen some of the newer versions, like Romeo and Juliet, the films, and perhaps the play, and how they're done? You know, they modernize things. Do you think that
Yeah,
takes?
yeah.
Okay, tell me about your visions on those.
Well, I guess I'm a traditionalist. I really prefer to see them in costume, in Elizabethan costume, or like Julius Caesar or Coriolanus, to see them in, togas. I really prefer that. I think that this kind of modern dress thing has run its course. It's been going on since, I think, the 30s or 40s, and I don't think that we need to do that. I think that if we had a real biography of Shakespeare, I think these plays are going to be more relatable than having to make them be in modern dress. That's just my opinion.
I also compose music, and one of the things I did 15 years ago was compose music for Shakespeare in the Park, which was a touring company here in Canada, and we used to go from park to park to park, but from city as well. And I remember traveling from Montreal to Kingston and various places in between, and the crowds were massive. The appeal for Shakespeare is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like it. And do you feel that, I guess what I'm asking is the universal appeal of Shakespeare? I recall the Star Trek with the great Canadian actor, oh geez, what's his name? He was playing a Klingon at the time, Christopher Plummer, saying, "Oh, you've not heard And Christopher Plummer, by the way, folks, the actor, is one of the mainstays at Stratford here in Ontario. Stratford is a city here in Ontario, and they put on Shakespeare plays all the time, and he's a mainstay there. He's probably the most popular actor to play Shakespeare plays, the main characters. And here he is, he's playing a Klingon in the Star Trek opposite William Shatner, who's also a Canadian. I have to get my Canadian plugs in there because they don't say about, but I do. And he says, "Oh, you've never heard Shakespeare until you've heard it in the original Klingon." And it just made me laugh because it was a tongue-in-cheek thing to say that not only is Shakespeare universal, but he's virtually right across the whole of the galaxy as well.
Well, I mean, Western civilization, so much of art was influenced by him. There's over 200 operas were written.
That's right.
That Shakespeare influenced.
Music as
so
well.
many books, and
yeah.
I mean, it goes on and on, his influence over us. We speak his language, and we don't even know. We don't even know that we're speaking his language.
Well, I wasn't aware of those words you mentioned in the first part of the hour.
Yeah, I mean, just read Hamlet, and you'll see so many expressions you can't even believe that that's where they originated.
It's absolutely amazing stuff. Do you think we'll see the likes of him again?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think, they were very rigorous education back then. Thorough training in Greek and Latin and the classics, and I think that sort of rigor is not present. So I think, or that discipline. But I hope so. I hope so.
Katherine, if you were able to travel back in time, we had mentioned interviews before, and all of a sudden you're writing your book, and all of a sudden there's the Earl right in front of you. What would be the first question you would ask him?
Where are the manuscripts? Where are the play manuscripts? Yeah.
Let's fast forward to today. Is there anybody out there right now, even in the royal family, that you would like to interview if they gave you the green light?
About this topic?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. No.
There's nobody at all, even in Britain, some archivalist, anything at all that you'd
I
like
would
to
like to do more research in Stratford on Avon, but yeah, no, there's no specific
Okay,
person. But I just wanted to mention
please.
that this website, doubtaboutwill.org, they have put out a £40,000 reward directed at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which is kind of the bastion of Shakespeare orthodoxy in England. A reward for them to prove their case in a mock trial that the Stratford man was a great author, and they have not been able to accept it, or they will not accept it.
Really?
So that tells you something right there.
Yeah, that's a bit of a red flag. No kidding. You think you would be called as a witness?
Well, I wouldn't mind participating. Yeah, that would be great. But I don't think we're going to get them to participate.
It's so funny, you know. I can understand the Kennedy assassination, and I keep referring to that one because the cover-up, folks, was for national security and still is. And, you can find out more about that in my book. But honest to God, who is Shakespeare threatening today if we find out indeed that it was the Earl? I mean, what bastions of literature are we going to shake to the foundations if we find out the actual truth behind who William Shakespeare was? And I just don't understand why what the threat is, and I don't understand why we don't delve more into it as a society. It's just absolutely, absolutely bizarre. And Catherine, would you have an answer for that one?
Well, I guess books and PhDs and things like that would, be rendered wrong. And maybe it's an ego thing. And there could be many reasons.
Who knows? Who knows? Folks, the book is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. Katherine Chiljan's the author and our guest tonight. You can easily get Catherine's book and all of our guest books, by the way, folks, and their websites and things like that. Kelly Lowe puts them right up on our website for free. www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. There is whole archives there. I mean, there's close to 200 shows at this point archived online, and they're all free. Topics range from UFOs to Bigfoot. Nobody covers the Kennedy assassination like Night Fright. Nobody. The RFK assassination as well, and Martin Luther King, of course. So there's a whole archive of first-person witnesses. The doctor who worked on JFK are there. Another person by the name of James Tague, who is featured in my book, he was the person responsible for the magic bullet theory that the Warren Commission came up with. The reason for that is James Tague was the third person injured in DEALEY PLAZA that day. Right after JFK, right after Governor Connolly, who was sitting in front of JFK, James Tague was over by the Triple Underpass, and he was wounded as well. Warren Report came out with its first report, there would be two, that said all three shots hit Kennedy. Two shots hit Kennedy, one shot hit Governor Connolly. Then James Tague came along and said, well, what about mine? The fourth shot, and they only had 3 bullets. So they knew that one bullet hit JFK in the head and killed him. So they extrapolated that bullet. Then they knew another shot had hit James Tague, the witness I had just mentioned. That left one bullet to make 7 wounds, 2 in Kennedy, 5 in Governor Connolly. Hence, we have what I call the Cirque du Soleil bullet, where it goes in, comes up and out, does a complete reversal in midair, and goes right into Governor Connolly. Absolutely bizarre thing. So all those shows are there for you free to listen to, do some research with, as I said. There's some amazing, incredible people out there like Katherine tonight who's done outstanding work. I mean, the whole thing about trying to find out the chronology of these plays, I mean, that's tedious, tough work. How do you even begin to do things like that? You can find out by getting her book, which is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Work, www.nightfrightshow.com. Katherine Chiljan, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
It's been fantastic. Once again, Mark Eddy, the person who recommended Katherine come on the show tonight, I want to thank you personally, my friend. It's been an absolute delight to have Katherine on the show. And Mark Eddy's show can be found also on Revolution Radio. You can just, Revolution Radio, Freedom Slips, I think it is .com. Just Google it. It'll come up. Check out the schedule. There's lots of great hosts and great shows on Revolution Radio. There's the music. I want to thank you all for joining me. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you next time.